Hello, I'm Tim Barnwell, and I'd like to welcome you to the Face of Appalachia.
There's a little bit of The Pretty Little Girl with the Blue Dress On. I heard it from Doug Wallen right here in Madison County. It's one Peggy liked. Stole my heart and away she's gone. Stole my heart and away she's gone. Stole my heart and away she's gone.
In this episode, we're going to get to know my longtime friend Peggy Harmon and her family, who lived on a farm in the remote Grapevine section of Madison County, North Carolina. We'll hear stories from Peggy, in her own words, from a talk I had with her in 2004, and learn more about her family through recent conversations with her sister-in-law Ellen Coomer, who worked as a school nurse at nearby Mars Hill College, neighbors Don and Jean Petty, who lived on the mountain across from the Harmon-Davis farm, and with Chris Parker and Kat Halton, the new owners of the place, as they share how they are using the farm today. I first met Peggy's parents, James and Portia Davis, when I was out photographing in 1983. I had driven up the steep dirt road that climbed the mountain at the end of the Grapevine Valley. At a clearing there, I set up my camera and began making images of the beautiful scene. I noticed among the many buildings on the farm below that a lady was sitting on the back porch of her cabin. I was worried she might be wondering what I was doing, as I am sometimes mistaken for a surveyor due to the unusual look of my large format camera. On my way back down, I stopped at the farm to introduce myself and found a couple, James and Portia Davis, working in their garden. I talked with them for a while, and they told me that the lady I had seen was James's older sister, Alice. I spent the afternoon with them and made photographs of Portia and James in their garden and of Alice sitting in her ladder-back chair on her porch. When I went back to deliver prints to the Davises a few weeks later, which I always do as a way of saying thanks to folks, I met their daughter, Peggy Harmon, and her husband, Nathan. Peggy worked in the Appalachian room at Mars Hill College and understood and appreciated my efforts to document and preserve elements of rural farm life. We became good friends and had many conversations over the years. Here's a story Peggy shares about her parents' gardening that always makes me smile.
They had that garden for years and years, and at one time Daddy had a garden wire fence around it and a neat little gate. Right in this area they had their sweet potato bed, where they put the sweet potatoes in the bed and sprouted them and got the plants instead of having to go buy them. They had corn, tomatoes, pepper, onions. Mother had a little onion she called a shallot onion, and it goes like by the name of a multiplying onion now. But it's an onion that you have to find somebody that has them to get the seed, and you have to try to keep the seed, or you just don't go out and buy them in the store. And cucumbers and squash, all kinds of winter squash, acorn squash, and potatoes. She had a garden full of that. And Daddy had it fenced off, but she would want him to plow it, so it'd be easier to hoe. But she always planted everything up to the fence, so Daddy couldn't plow it. He couldn't get the plow and the horse around without tearing so much of it up. So if he tried to plow it, there was a lost cause, because she thought she had to have everything to the end to get that much more material, or vegetables and things. But then when he plowed it and he tore that down, she'd already lost that. And she really went in a hole, because, see, she's done extra work, but if she hadn't done it, she wouldn't have had nothing tore down.
My name is Ellen Harmon Coomer. I was born on Big Laurel and lived there till I was 5. And then I moved to Grapevine because my mother grew up on Grapevine, and we moved there. And my dad was a tenant farmer, so we moved to different places. I lived in Marshall for a while, but mostly in Grapevine till I went away to school.
So you had one brother, one sister?
I had 2 brothers. My oldest brother lived in Black Mountain. He passed away. And my sister's still living. She's out in Hendersonville with her daughter. And of course, my brother Nathan, that I was closest to, he passed away a few years ago. So. Nathan was my youngest brother, and we were almost 2 years apart. And we were always the closest of the children. And he and Peggy got married while I lived away, but I'd known Peggy since she was a little girl. You know, we all went to Grapevine Elementary. Everybody walked to school and all that. And I think they dated 10 or 12 years before they got married. You know, she was an only child and very dedicated to her mother and daddy. He tried to get her to move away from the place where they lived, and she wouldn't, so he moved there, you know. He and Peggy always worked together on the farm. They, you know, she would raise her own sweet potato plants, and they'd plant a big patch of sweet potatoes, and they had a garden, and you know, and the goats, Peggy was famous for her goats, and he would help take care of them, and horses, and dogs. They always had a dog, or 2 or 3, you know, so.
We just loved living out here, and, you know, now all the old folks are mostly gone. All the people that, you know, Stokely Norton lived next door, and Junior and Flossie down below us, and Nathan and Peggy, I mean, and just a number of, you know, Farrell, and just a number of the older folks are gone.
Yep.
Who we learned so much, learned a lot from, just enjoyed living. Certainly slow your pace now. Well, you know, I met Peggy in 1980.
Really?
Yeah. A friend of mine, Andy Wolf, he was a fiddle player. He was a doctor of musicology. We judged this contest up in Lowell. He was from Massachusetts. He came down, we played some festivals, went over to the museum at the college over there. Well, it was a college then.
Marshall College.
Yeah, and now it's the university, and the library's a big new library. It used to be in the building across the road. And we went in there, and this really nice woman who knew everything about all the music and all the people around here turned out to be Peggy. Years later, we moved out here, and she was our neighbor.
Right.
And I remembered her from there because she stood up for being so nice.
Sure.
I'd go over and play for Peggy often, and her favorite ones was the pretty little girl with the blue dress on, which is just Madison County, and she liked Pretty Peggy-O.
Okay.
Yeah, those were her 2 favorites. I have to do them every time I went.
Right.
And but yeah, I'd go over and play. I'd play at the molasses when we'd be making the sorghum. That was usually my job. They had plenty of people to skim and stuff. I'd carry buckets and help a little, but mostly I played music.
Keep them motivated.
I mostly played music and ate.
Braddy was 4 years old when they moved there, and he was 96 when he died, so he'd been there for 92 years on that place. So you can see why that blood's still in me very deep. He made molasses up until 75. My daddy had a real bad spell with what we call now vertigo. That particular year that he got sick, he had the largest crop that he had had in several years, and a large cane patch. And Mother said, how in the world are we going to get that cane patch made up? So Dr. Jolly had been coming down to the house when they were making molasses, taking photographs. He told Mother, said, we've been thinking about something, and said, we want to help y'all get those molasses made. So Dr. Jolly brought his classes down every day till all those molasses were made. There would be about maybe 10, 12, 15 boys and girls. And I mean, nobody's sure. The girls worked just as hard as the boys, and the boys as hard as the girls. And they went into the field and they stripped the fodder off the cane. They cut the heads off. They cut it and hauled it down on a sled to the furnace. And they just done everything that was to be done. And they were as happy as lark, and Mother cooked for them. And that made them even happier.
Peggy was more or less raised by older people. I mean, she had her parents, Aunt Alice, and her grandmother was living at the time when she was little. So she was always more like an adult than she was a child, you know. I remember she was smaller because she was maybe 2 or 3 years younger than I was. But there was only, I don't know how many kids there. We all played together, you know. And the thing that always impressed me, her mother made her clothes, and they were always matching. And Peggy, forgive me, but her her dress and homemade panties always matched, and that was fascinating to me, you know. But she was always just special. I mean, she kind of stood out with the other kids, because I guess most of them had brothers and sisters, but she, you know, she was an only child. And by the time she was in high school, I was living away, but I know she was an honors student at Marshall High School. But Peggy lived her entire life when she was real little, they lived in a old Victorian type house as you start up Grapevine after you pass Arrington Branch. And then her dad built that house that they lived in, and she lived there. And then when she and Nathan married, they moved out in the yard, more or less, into a mobile home. And that's the only place she had ever lived. As she got older, she adapted more of the old-fashioned ways, as she would call them. And she and her mother were just inseparable, you know, and her mother knew so much about all that old way of living. And when they were getting the Appalachian Museum at the college, Peggy and her mom redid or refurnished or whatever so much of that stuff that they had in that, and she was so proud of that, you know. As she got older, she was proud, and in fact, she wanted to be known as a mountain woman. I mean, that was, and Tim probably remembers how she really was proud of the fact that she was a mountain woman. I remember one time when she was working in the Appalachian room, they had tours, you know, school kids or different people would come in, and they asked her if her dress was part of the costume and she said, no, that's the way I dress all the time. And, you know, she dressed old-fashioned, and I just thought it fit her perfect.
She was an animal lover. I mean, all animals. You know, she has a donkey, and I'm not sure what they're calling donkey now, but that's what we call them. And then she has, I think they still have the same horse that they had.
Blackie.
And she had goats all the time, and one or another of them she was always milking, you know, and she'd be up there having a time with one, and the others were fighting, but she loved those goats. It was not unusual to see her walk through the field and have a little trail of goats behind her, especially when the new ones, the new kids came. And they had cats.
Oh,
and they
yeah.
always had at least one, if not more, dogs. And I do remember the time they had gone up the road all the way up over towards Laurel from here, and they kept hearing something. They looked over on the side of the road, and somebody had dumped a mama and her babies. And so they picked them up, and they came over, and they said, "Do you want to take a couple?" I don't remember how many there were.
We had 3 at the time, so we did not.
We declined, and she said, "Well, we're going to keep these 2."
I hadn't been back to the farm since Peggy and Nathan passed away in 2016, so was thrilled when Ellen Coomer offered to introduce me to the new owners, Chris Parker and Kat Halton. Ellen and her sister Alta are so happy with how Chris and Kat have adapted the farm to their own use while preserving its original character, even taking over Peggy and Nathan's farm animals and pets. Ellen joined me as we sat down with Chris and Kat for a visit.
My name's Christopher Parker. I was born and raised here in Western North Carolina and have lived most of my life here, in fact 95% of it. So I was born in Rutherfordton, and my mother's family is from Rutherford County and my father's family is from Cherokee. So I've lived in various places in Western North Carolina.
My name's Kat. I'm from the UK. I grew up in England and Scotland, Northern England and Southern Scotland. I grew up on a farm there. My parents still live in Southern Scotland. They got a hill farm is what it's called there, which is very similar to here, except we cut our trees down a long time ago. I've been in the United States since the year 2000. I've been in the Western North Carolina region since 2016. And we've been here now for just over 2.5 years on this property.
So basically, Kat and I here on the farm, the farm's name is the Forest Pharmacy. So what we do is a lot of mushroom production. We also do woodland medicinals, herbal stuff. So I teach different classes in mycology, everything from basic, simple cultivation to sterile lab stuff. And so we do 2 tailgate markets in Asheville currently, and we have indoor production of mushrooms as well as outdoor production of mushrooms.
We were looking for forest area, obviously, because the mushrooms, that's what they like to grow in, and so there's 20 acres of this land is forested. But this was a bonus, this other acreage with the pastures and the barns and then all these buildings. We were looking just for a raw plot of land. And then we came across this place, and they had all this history on it, which was, I think, part of what drew us in, that there was already people who had loved and tended this land so clearly for so long that it felt welcoming, I think, to us. I mean, the dogs were welcoming and all the animals were welcoming, and it felt just like a clear yes.
And I personally really like old stuff. Like if it's got a lot of patina on it and it's really rusty, like I just absolutely love it. So I change things the least amount possible. And for me, that's one of the things too, like it's continuing to honor the people who were here before me, but changing those things to utilize what we need out of them as well.
And Alice, my aunt, she broke her hip in 86 or 87, and she spent the rest, about 4 years, in the nursing home. And other than that, she was there I think she was about 13 years old when they came from Big Laurel across the Hinkle's Gap and bought that place. And she'd been there ever since until the last 4 years of her life, and she died in the nursing home. Every calendar from every peddler that came through that had calendars, she just hung them up on the wall. And this is nothing compared with what used to be there when my grandmother's living, because after my grandmother died, I guess Alice, she was up in years, and in taking care and keeping the dust and everything off of stuff, she began to kind of take it down and move it around. And she had linoleum on that floor. Peddlers would come through, with rows of linoleum, that's what it was called at that time. And maybe you had to buy 2 of them to get enough to cover the floor. So when they would come through, Alice would try to have enough money and she'd buy some to put down on the floor to keep the air from coming through. When I took that linoleum up, I found all these papers underneath it from department stores. You probably remember they would have a long holder for paper, and you didn't have the bags at that time to put stuff in. They would just rip these sheets of paper off, however large they needed to cut to pull them off to wrap whatever up in. And it was, some of them are as neat as they were if they'd come off the roll today. And what I've planned on doing is pressing them out as flat as I can and framing them. They're from stores like Paul Rector's that used to be in Marshall in the 20s, McKinney's department store, and she had stuck these papers underneath there to add more warmth, I guess. Whatever store had their names on the paper, and if you happen to get a large enough piece, you got a slice of the advertisement on the store.
In March of 2016, I got a call that Peggy was back at home and receiving end-of-life care. I went to visit and sat at her bedside with family and friends, including Don and Jean Petty and Ellen Coomer and her sister Alta. Don played some of Peggy's favorite tunes on the dulcimer to comfort her, and people visited and shared stories about Peggy over several days. The scene took me back to the time I photographed Peggy consoling her Aunt Alice in her bed in the cabin next door when Alice was ill. Over Peggy's last days, her husband Nathan was with her constantly, despite his failing health. Within a few months of her passing, he died as well, and they are both buried in a small plot there on the farm. Walking through the old Harmon-Davis farm with Ellen Coomer brought back a flood of memories as she and I shared tales about Peggy and Nathan, Peggy's parents James and Portia, her Aunt Alice, and their lives on this multi-generational farm. Every structure, path, and plot of ground held a memory and elicited a story. I always admired Peggy's desire to remain authentic and faithful to her roots. She was devoted to her parents, Aunt Alice, Nathan, her animals, and her work. She valued the traditional ways that she learned growing up in Appalachia and worked to preserve them by example in her own life and through her work at the Appalachian Room and Rural Life Museum at Mars Hill College. She led a modest life in many ways, but one doesn't have to be rich, famous, or powerful to have an influence on your community. It just takes strong character, a sense of purpose, and a love of friends and neighbors. Peggy exemplified all these traits, and that's why she was admired and respected by all who knew her, and why her life still influences ours today. If you share my interest in the people and places I call home, be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to learn more about this way of life. On this channel, I hope to continue to celebrate the people, culture, and rich heritage of Appalachia.